Hello, hello. Good evening. Good to see you all again. You are the faithful, the ones who made it to a Monday night presentation. Amen. I'm glad for you guys being here. Thank you. Can we give a round of applause for the music? It's been beautiful. Appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. So the last two nights that we started these presentations, we were identifying what trauma is and what happens when it overwhelms our system and our capacity to cope, what's actually going on in our brains when we get to these places. Now, trauma often leads to anxiety and depression, but I do want to be clear that that's not the only cause, right? So if you're going through depression, if you're going through anxiety and you're like, well, I don't have that much trauma in my background, that's understandable. There's numerous causes for something like depression, anxiety, or other mood disorders, things that we might be dealing with. For example, someone brought up in the first night asking about a chemical imbalance, and that's a real thing. There are really times where our brains are not producing the proper chemicals or at the proper amounts, and because of that, it just affects the way that we see the world. It affects the way that we look at things. And so for those people where it is primarily a chemical imbalance, that's oftentimes where they may need to have some medication that will help provide for what they're doing. And maybe we'll address the concept of medication a little bit later. But right now, I wanted to get into a little bit more practical stuff. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And as usual, we're going to have some conversation time. More than last night. Last night we were pretty packed in, so we didn't have much time to talk. But I do want to encourage you to, if you have questions or comments, feel free to raise your hand. But this is really about, like, what can we actually do? Or how can I help my friends, my family, someone who's really going through something? Now, again, I want to be clear. Just like anxiety and depression, these things, they can have so many different causes. In the same way, there's no easy fix for anything, okay? So I'm going to give you some real practical tools and some things that pretty much anyone can try. But if you're already trying those things and it's still not working for you, that's when I encourage you to talk to somebody who has a little bit more training, who can maybe help walk you through and identify some other things that might be going on. So don't be discouraged, or don't think, oh yeah, I'm super sad, I'm going through a lot. You know, if I just do these things, I'm going to automatically be better. We know that's not how things work. But these are things that science has shown and experience has shown that these things do really help people. And you're going to be able to realize that the majority of them are things that you already knew about. The deeper I get into understanding the science and the training that I've got on how to help a brain to heal, the more I'm like, oh yeah, this is what we're supposed to do. This is just healthy living, right? But the reality is that we're not always in a healthy culture. So healthy living is not an automatic thing. So sometimes we have to be a little bit more intentional about that. One other point I wanted to make, I was having a conversation with someone last night, and I think it's important to bring this out as well. Some of you may have grown up in a place where you say, well, where I'm from, you know, we really don't talk about mental health. And some people might even say, we don't have depression where I'm from. We don't have these mental illnesses where I grew up or with my community. And what they have found over and over is that there are places in the world where there's not language and it's not really acceptable to talk about mental health issues. But that doesn't mean they don't exist. What they've found is people who cannot talk about their mental challenges, they will go to their doctor and they'll talk about physical challenges because it's more acceptable in any culture almost in the world to talk about physical ailments. So there are people who will go to their doctor and they'll talk about some pain in their back or their neck or maybe nerve issues. And the doctor can search and look and do all these tests and say, well, we don't actually see anything going on here. Oftentimes for those people, it's because they cannot verbalize that what's really going on is an internal issue. It's something that's going on within their own mind, but they don't have the language to share that. So just because maybe you grew up in a place where we didn't talk about mental health or depression or anxiety doesn't mean it wasn't there in that world. It was just hidden. It came out in different ways. There's a great book, if you want to go deeper into some of the stuff we've been talking about, called The Body Keeps the Score. Now, that book comes from like sort of an evolutionary viewpoint, so there's a few points that if you're coming from a faith background, you may not agree with some of the ways they talk about how the brain develops, but the science is very sound. And it explains a lot of this and the impact of trauma. So a lot of things we've talked about in the last 2 days have been derived partly from that book. And it really can help, especially if you've gone through a lot. It might help you to understand yourself a little bit better. Okay, before we get into the idea of resilience, I wanted to point this out. So I was doing some research when I was up at grad school, and we wanted to see if there had been any data that had come out about the impact of the pandemic on the developing brain. And we found, I can't remember which year this was, probably about 2 years ago now, they had done a meta-analysis. What that means is they took all the studies they could find, and they studied all the studies, and then they gave a broader sort of, this is what's going on. And they had 29 studies that they had analyzed with over 80,000 participants. And they found that among children, so I don't know how they defined it, I think it was 0 to 18, but probably towards the teen years, says that cases of depression doubled just over the time of the pandemic. So we're talking about clinical depression here, not just sadness, that kids were becoming more and more depressed as a result of the impact of the pandemic. Okay, doubled to 25%. So we're talking 1 in 4 young people. That's a pretty large amount, right? I mean, that's an incredible amount of people. So this is not an isolated event. There's a lot of discussion on why this is happening, what was going on. We know that the pandemic disrupted social life, so your social setting was not the same. Your community, you didn't always have access to. We also know that it was an increase of screen time, right? So we had school from home. I had school from home for a year as well. And so all day, I was on Zoom calls, and I was doing my homework online. I was doing my studying online. And then, like I talked about on the first day, I was doing my playtime online. So all that time, I'm sitting in front of a screen, and I'm also not moving my body. And I think it really impacted me. I went to a pretty kind of dark place where I was getting kind of depressed. That was one of the reasons. There's all kinds of reasons. Notice anxiety cases. They also doubled from 11% of the population to 20% of the population of the ones they studied, meaning 1 in 4 young people may be dealing with some form of mild to severe depression on this clinical scale, and 1 in 5 young people may be dealing with anxiety that's clinically significant, meaning it's important to pay attention to. It's impacting their lives. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of kids, right? That means that if you know 4 or 5 kids in your life, if you've got friends, family, whatever, you work at a school, guarantee you've got people who are dealing with this on an ongoing basis. And when you are dealing with these things, you cannot see the world in the same way. Everything changes with the way that you perceive the world. Things that should be easy for you become extremely difficult, extremely challenging. And it's hard when you're not in it. It's hard to relate to those people. But if that's not you, if you don't struggle with depression, you don't struggle with anxiety, again, praise the Lord for that. Just try to listen to these things because someone you know is going through these types of issues. Okay, so the 3 pillars of trauma-informed care. This is, again, what we're going to be basing how to help people. At its core, there's really 3 things that we want to help anybody who's going through these types of things. They're very specific. They're very broad, and they're broad because they're so just foundational to what we want to do. Number 1, these aren't in any order. It doesn't matter which one you're working on. Number 1 is creating a safe environment. This does not just mean physical safety. This means creating relational safety. Remember, I talked about last night, people cannot heal. They're not going to work on their problems if they do not feel safe. That's just the reality of it. When you're in survival mode, you're not going to heal. You have to survive. So part of it is creating an environment where people can come out of survival mode. Whatever's putting them in survival mode, we can ensure that at least around them, they have a calm, safe place with people around them who are going to help them. Number 2, and again, not in any order, is supporting and teaching emotional regulation. So we talked about yesterday that window of tolerance and how once you get to a certain point, you can flip your lid. You can get to this place where you're not thinking rationally anymore. You're thinking based on emotion. Whenever you're thinking based on emotion, that's a survival technique, and it's good in certain situations, but we often make the decisions that we regret when we're in this place instead of in this place. If you guys weren't here yesterday, ask somebody. They can tell you what that means. But we want to help people when they get to this place, when they get overwhelmed, we want to help them to be able to manage their own emotion. Because again, you can't take all stress away from this life. So we're not teaching people how to get rid of all your stress. We're teaching people how to manage their stress so they don't get to a point where they're just overwhelmed and very reactive, overreactive to different things. And finally, we need healthy relationships and connectedness. Someone once said, you were wounded in community, meaning the trauma that happened was in a community, and you also need to be healed in community. If you're going to be healed, it's not going to be by yourself. Very few people can heal entirely by themselves. They need people in their lives, people in their corner, people who love them unconditionally or as unconditionally as we can as humans. And that changes people. And we're sitting here in a church, and I think this is what God created church for, to be a safe environment, to build these connections, to have a community of people who are in your corner at all times. That can transform and change people's lives. It can give them a new hope and a new faith in God because they see people who love them like Jesus would love them if he was here today. Okay, so this is the key word that we're going to talk about, resilience. Resilience, so we talked for 2 days about trauma, now we're talking about resilience. What happens when trauma takes place? How can we be resilient people? So raise your hand if you have some definition of what resilience means. Can you share that with us? I know we got one up on there, but in your own words, what does it mean to be a resilient person? Anybody brave enough to share? Bouncing back easily. Now, we do have a microphone, so anybody else, I'd love for you, just so if there's people on the stream, they can hear it, but bouncing back easily, that's a good one. I think I saw your hand.
Withstanding whatever the pressure you might be dealing with, whatever is causing the trauma, to be able to withstand the cause of the trauma.
Absolutely. Withstanding the pressure. Okay, that's great. Anybody else got something else they wanted to share as far as their definition of resilience? I'm seeing someone being pointed out. I don't know if they really wanted to answer or not, though. I guess not. Okay. Yes, so resilience is that idea of when pressure is applied, when negativity takes place. We talked about adverse childhood experiences. When those bad things do take place, how well are we able to withstand it or to bounce back, to go back to a healthy place? So this is a dictionary definition, kind of. Resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. And they continue and identify all kinds of things. The reality is, again, I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but you cannot get through this life without adversity. You cannot get through this life without tragedy. That's the sad part about this world that we live in. So we do not want to simply protect people from all tragedy. Of course we want to, but we cannot. So we need to prepare people for when these things happen. How can they get through it, right? Because you're going to have to. If you haven't yet, and we know in this church we've had to, but if you have not yet had to go through tragedy and trauma and adversity, you will at some point. So how can we move forward with it when we're in the midst of all of that darkness, all of that muck in the mud? I'm going to give you a couple different definitions or things that we're looking for when we want to be resilient people. So I don't know if you can read those on the screen. I know they're kind of small wording, but there's 4 basic elements, according to this model, of what it means to be a resilient person. The first one, and again, we're going to keep coming back to this. The first is relationships. One of the biggest differences between whether or not somebody is able to overcome a tragedy or not is the relationships that they can rely on when they're in the middle of that tragedy. If you feel like you have nobody, right? There's a song that says, nobody knows you when you're down and out, right? The reality is when life is tough and things are hard, man, all those people who used to come over and call you, hang out with you, they're not there anymore. But there are some people, hopefully, and that's your people. Those are your relationships, the ones that will get you through the tough times. So having healthy relationships is a huge protective factor in whether or not you can manage the things that are going to happen in life. Another one is affect control. This, again, is just a fancy word of being able to manage your own emotions. So if you want to be a resilient person, you have to manage emotions. Now, there's two extremes that often happen. There's some people who are very uncomfortable with emotions. So what they do is they hide it entirely. I'm just going to pretend I don't have emotions. Or if I do, I only have like one or two. Oh, I was talking about this with someone recently. For men, a lot of times, there only seems to be one acceptable emotion to show, and that's anger, right? So a lot of times, men will show anger, right? But underneath the anger are all the other emotions that we haven't really been able to identify or talk about because it just hasn't felt safe to do so. So one group of people tries to avoid emotion altogether. Other people get all kinds of emotion, but they can't manage it. It overwhelms them. So these are people who maybe are angry very quickly, or they're so overwhelmed that even if a really small thing takes place, they're crying and sort of overwhelmed, and they can't bring themselves back together. It's just like their whole day just kind of gets shot when that takes place. That is a sign that their affect control, their ability to manage their own stress, has been overwhelmed. And that doesn't mean that they're weak. There's nothing like inherently wrong with that person. It just means they've gotten to a point where they can't do it on their own right now. They need that relationship. They need maybe some better tools. Okay, so relationships, affect, control. Another one, if we want to be resilient people, is to have a sense of mastery. In other words, if something takes place, oftentimes maybe a failure takes place or something that we're a little bit afraid of. At first, we may be really tempted to think, I can't do this, right? Have you ever just told yourself, or you hear someone say, I can't do it. I just can't do it. I can't do it. Because for that person in that time, they don't feel the sense of mastery that they, this might be tough, this might be overwhelming, but I can get through this. I can learn how to deal with this. And so we want to build, especially with young people, we want to build and instill in them a sense that they are capable of learning new skills, of being able to manage new challenges and new issues. And if they do that in small things, and if we can do that in small things, we gain a sense of mastery. Okay, that was tough, but I accomplished it. That means if I accomplish that, I can also get through this. And having that sense of mastery, that sense that no matter how heavy it feels, there is an inner strength that is available. And for those of us who are people of faith, we believe that strength really comes from God, right? And so that strength is available, that maybe I can't do this, but maybe God can do this through me. Either way, the same process is there, that there's a sense of mastery. And beyond that, as we learn to master new skills, we gain a sense of self-esteem, meaning that, again, this is not being arrogant and thinking we're the best people in the world, but we recognize, again, our own sense of worth and value, and that enables us to have healthy boundaries. It enables us to believe in ourselves, like in who God has created us to be, and that changes the way we look at situations. That changes the way we look at trauma and tragedy. There's another one. This one's got more of them, but they all start with C, so it's fun to share. It's the same basic idea, though. Attributes that lead to resilience. And these aren't in any particular order, but these things will all help you to be a resilient person. And if you or someone you know is struggling, it may be because one of these areas we're still kind of growing in. We have some work to do in them. Competence, that's the same thing as mastery. Confidence, that's the self-esteem. Character, who we are as people. In other words, are we proud of who we are, or are we okay with who we are? Does that make sense? Sometimes we know within ourselves that who we want to be is not who we are right now. And when we're in that place, we can be really, really negative towards ourselves. And it's really hard for us to be resilient in those moments. Control, being able to manage ourselves. Coping skills, these are the practical things we'll talk about in a little bit. Contribution, giving to others. There's something about service. We are created to serve. So even in the midst of our struggles, if we can help someone else, that can help us to be more resilient people as well. And finally, connection. That's the relationships. Okay, this is a video. I think it explains this concept of resilience in a really healthy way. I think we've got it all set up there with the audio and everything. So I'm going to step off the stage and we'll watch this video real quick.
Brains. They are everywhere. In the world's gentlest places and its harshest. In this unforgiving environment, some brains exhibit troubling signs. Addiction, illness, depression, social disorder. Yet others thrive. Why have some brains developed the ability to cope in harsh conditions while others struggle? It is one of nature's great secrets.
Hi. Hello? This is amazing. But I just need to clarify a few things. This great secret? It's actually science. Severe adversity isn't good for any brain. But it is true that some brains do better than others in the face of significant challenges.
Oh, a scientist. Yes, I agree. This is a great secret of science.
Great, yes, but not a secret. Let me explain. We're born with brains, but our brains change as we grow. They develop based on experiences we have, and different brains respond to experiences in different ways. Okay, thanks. I'll let you get back to it.
Indeed. Some brains show robustity and strongitude, while others...
Sorry, we scientists use the word resilience. Some brains are more resilient than others.
Yes, resiliensis.
Resilience?
Resilience. Revenge of the cortex.
Resilience is a result of the interplay between genes and life experiences. It's a brain's ability to maintain good functioning under adversity.
Resilience makes us invincible.
Nothing makes us invincible. What resilience does is to give less leverage to negative factors in our lives and tip the balance in favor of positive outcomes.
Resilience. Fate's legendary prize.
Whoa, no! Some people are born with more resilience than others, but resilience can also be built over time. It's a big project involving parents, caregivers, teachers,
Kith, kin, karaoke comrades,
soccer coaches, counselors,
pastry chefs, associate producers, even millennials. Like a barn raising in times of old.
Yeah. In fact, we scientists believe strong brain architecture is the foundation for resilience. And, oh, look over there.
Oh, yes. A young brain returns after months of isolation and adversity. No words can describe what this poor brain has suffered.
There are words that describe it. We scientists call it toxic stress.
Toxic stress lies in wait.
No, Stress happens inside the body. It's the fight or flight system kicking in. But if stress hormones are elevated too high and for too long, it can have negative effects on the brain and body.
Stress, a nasty poison.
Not all stress, just toxic stress. With the right supports, we can make severe stress tolerable, which means it won't do lasting damage. Stress can even be positive because it helps us to learn problem solving and coping skills, which leads us back to resilience.
Alas, this brain is resilience-less.
No, it isn't. Let me explain. Remember when I talked about giving less leverage to negative experiences and tipping the scale in a positive direction? Well, here's a little something I've been working on. It's a really amazing metaphor. Here goes. I call it the resilience scale.
Resilience scales. Protective armor plates that
Shiny. But no. The resilience scale helps us understand why some brains are more resilient than others.
The resilience scale sends out invisible resilience rays that's
It's really just a scale. See? It's a beam being held up by a fulcrum.
full of crumbs.
Geez, no! A fulcrum. You know, like high school Never mind. Let me just clean this up. See, negative experiences add weight to one end of the beam, and positive factors add weight to the other end. Ideally, we want the scale to tip toward the positive side, and lead towards positive life outcomes.
The brain's future literally hangs in the balance.
The position of the fulcrum can be understood as our original capacity for resilience. It's something like our genetic starting position. Remember the young brain that was struggling to survive? Look, it started life with the fulcrum off-center, giving more leverage to negative experiences, serious stuff like abuse, neglect, and chaotic environments. That means positive factors like responsive relationships, safe environments, and learning opportunities had less leverage. Over time, the negative load shifted the fulcrum even farther in a negative direction.
Tragedy.
Not at all. Right now, this brain is experiencing poor health. But with help, the scale can be tipped toward more positive outcomes. The first thing we can do is to stop negative experiences from stacking up. Then, we can add more positive factors, loading up the positive side of the scale. And we're not done. We can work to shift the fulcrum in a way that favors positive outcomes.
The fulcrum, an amazing instant fix-it button.
No, it's a process. It involves many supportive people and plenty of time. Remember? This brain is still young, so adult brains can work with it to relieve toxic stress and teach coping skills. In early childhood, these efforts can push the fulcrum a considerable distance.
Childhood, filled with fascination and fulcrum flexibility.
Sort of, but there are other sensitive developmental periods that are windows of opportunity, like adolescence. And even if this brain doesn't get help until adulthood, change is still possible. It will take more support, and the change will be less dramatic. But any fulcrum can be moved to make positive outcomes more achievable.
The bad experiences disappear.
I'm afraid not. It's hard to undo the effects of past negative experiences, and it takes time. But we can eventually relieve the burden of those negative experiences. Our little brain can get the help it needs to adapt, recover, and enjoy good health and wellness.
And everyone, everywhere can become more resilient for eternity.
Why not? With the right support, everyone everywhere can become more resilient.
I'm so glad I saved humanity. It's been a majestic experience.
Yeah, me too. Well done.
Okay, so that's a somewhat humorous look at the idea of resilience. But do you see what we're talking about here? There's a scale that's at play in our lives. What we talked about with trauma and stuff is these are the negative elements that have been added to that scale, the things that have happened to us. And then there's a genetic aspect, which is what sort of is our starting point with how healthy or how resilient or lack of resilient we're going to be just starting off. And then there's all the positive things that we can add that will really help people. The younger a person is, the more dramatic that change can be. But that doesn't mean, even if we've gone into our adult life and we're still struggling, we're still going through things, that doesn't mean that change doesn't take place. Like the video said, it's just a little less dramatic, but we still see change and growth and healing. So before we go into any of the tools and stuff, I wanted to pause. Are there any thoughts or questions based on what we've talked about so far? Anybody had something they wanted to add to the conversation? Wow, talkative crowd. You don't have to have questions, but I love it if you do. So anybody? Okay, we'll continue on. So yesterday I introduced this idea of the hand model of the brain. Again, this is just a real simple way of understanding how our brain develops. Remember, you got the first part of the brain, which is the brain stem. Then you got the limbic system. This is the emotional part of our brain that develops next. And then finally, once we get to adulthood, we get to a place where our prefrontal cortex has fully come online, and that's our logical thinking part of the brain. That's what God has given us in a broader way, in a more full way than any other creature on the planet. And so when we're in a place where we get overwhelmed, where our stress gets to a certain point, we will oftentimes flip our lid. We go to survival mode. Again, that is not an inherently bad thing. That's a God-given thing. And let me explain that. Okay, so we can talk about this as thinking brain and feeling brain. This is your thinking brain, this is your feeling brain. You need both of these. And sometimes we teach kids this way. You have a wise owl and you have a barking dog, okay? So your wise owl is your thinking brain. That's when everything is good. The wise owl sits on the branch and is helping you to make your decisions and think through the process of life. But then, say a threat is perceived in your brain for one reason or another, well, it's time for the barking dog to take over, right? That barking dog is going to take over. It's going to try to scare away the threat. It's going to try to deal with the situation. But what is going to happen to the owl when the dog starts barking? It's going to fly away, right? Owls don't like hearing dogs barking at them and everything. And so that's what's happening when you flip your lid. The wise owl takes off. The barking dog takes over. That's good when there's a real threat. The problem is those of us who have maybe been through some challenging things in our life is we can see something as a threat that's not actually a threat. And so the dog can start barking a lot quicker for us than maybe for other people. And that means that we become really reactive very quickly. We fight quicker or we avoid faster. We get very frustrated very quickly. That's because our barking dog is barking a lot more than other people, right? And so what we need to do is we need to understand when a situation is a real threat versus when it's just something that reminds us of a threat in the past. And if it's a real threat, we want the dog to be barking. Like we talked about the deer jumping out in front of us, we need to be able to manage that really quickly. We got to make fast decisions. But if we're aware of it, we can say, okay, you know what? I'm overreacting right now, but this is not a situation that needs an overreaction. This is something about my own stuff, right? My own stuff is coming up, dog is barking. So if I understand that, and I'm also with a family or friends or whatever who also understand that, we can help each other to say, hey, are you here right now? Like, where are you at? And if I'm here, I know that my job is to help calm the dog down so the wise owl can fly back to the roost. In other words, I'm trying to calm myself in such a way that I can have my thinking brain come back online and I don't do things that I end up regretting later. Some of us, because of the stress that we're dealing with in our lives and because we haven't maybe managed our stress very well, we can be in a place where we're here almost all the time. That dog is barking all the time. And so we end up making all kinds of decisions that we know are not the right decisions, but we're just trying to survive. But the goal is to not just survive. The goal is that God wants us to have lives to the full. He wants us to thrive. And so we've got to learn how to manage that barking dog in a healthy way. One other concept I think is really important, and we discussed this. Those of you who were here yesterday, you remember the video clip I played where I tricked you a little bit and told you to relax, and then all of a sudden the music changed, and some of you described some of the changes in your body. And that's a really fascinating thing that we see over and over again, is that the body will feel a change before your brain will register it. So sometimes your body, for example, will tense up, and the dog's actually starting to bark before you even realize what's going on. And so an example my professor often used, she would sometimes have people, they would come up and they would smell something, and she'd ask them what it reminded them of, and it was cinnamon. And so for almost all of them, it reminded them of some beautiful home memory, usually fall or Christmas or something like that. It was a really positive experience. And she was doing this one time, and a lady came up to her afterwards. She said, I know what you're trying to do, and I appreciate it, but I want you to know, like, when I smell that cinnamon, my body tenses up, and my heart starts racing, because that smells exactly like the home where the things that happened to me took place. And so for everyone else, they're feeling relaxed and enjoyable, right? This is a really positive thing. And she was using cinnamon because she assumed pretty much everyone would have a positive experience with cinnamon. And she had to understand, and it's helped to teach me as well, that sometimes people will be triggered by things that don't make sense to anybody else, right? That because it's based on our painful past experience, I could be up here and I could say something that is totally innocent, but the way I say it could remind your brain and your body of something totally different in the past, and it can trigger a negative response from you. That has nothing to do with me, but I wouldn't even know about it, right? And sometimes you won't even know why you're behaving the way that you're behaving unless you start working on awareness. Why? Like, what is my body feeling right now? Am I feeling tense in any part of my body? And then trying to identify where that's coming from. because your body will feel it far before your mind will. Okay, so this is a process that we try to introduce even in the classes I took up at the School of Social Work. That's a brain break. So the idea is that after about 20 minutes, the hemispheres in our brain, you have your right and left hemisphere, they kind of stop communicating with each other. And that's usually when you start getting tired, you get a little bit, your attention doesn't work quite as well. So one of the real practical things you can do, especially if you're working with young people or whatever, is you can institute after about 20, 25 minutes, a brain break. This is a way to get those hemispheres to talk again. So there's real simple ones you can have, like if they're real tired and low energy, and if you are too, you could always do like wall push-ups or chair sit-ups and things like that. But there's other ones that you can do. Basically, anytime you do something across the middle of your body, it's reawakening your brain. So I'm going to have you do one right now. I like to watch this one. All right? So I want you to pretend that you're a carpenter. Do we have any actual carpenters in the room? Last time I did this, there was an actual carpenter, so he didn't have to pretend. But for the rest of us, pretend you're a carpenter, and I want you to pretend that you are a procrastinating carpenter, and you're working on a deadline, and you're really way behind, so you're trying to get something done. So this is your hammer, okay? I want you to show me your hammer. All right, one hand is your hammer, and so you're hammering away, you're trying to get things done, but you got to move real fast. So this is your saw, okay? So I want you to saw and hammer at the same time. Yeah, I'm doing terrible up here too. This is always fun to watch a group of people try to do, though. Okay, so now we got to switch hands, right? So your hammer's in the other hand, your saw's in the other one, and keep trying. Well, I think you're missing the nails a few times, but it was a good try. It was a good try. Okay, so doing something like that, anything, you can look these up. You can look up brain breaks on YouTube, and you'll see all of them. Here's another one that sometimes we talk about, which is a much more quiet one. So I sometimes do this too, like if it's been a long day and I still have someone maybe I need to talk to about something deep, but I'm not listening, like my brain's just tired. There's one called a hungry caterpillar, and it's where you kind of pretend to eat your finger with this little caterpillar, and you kind of pull it off at the end. Now you can do this like below a table, and you're just kind of squeezing a little bit and just pretending to eat it, to bite it. And you can do this for each finger. And I don't know why it works, but I know that at least for me, this really, really helps me. When my attention span is gone and I'm having a hard time, but I know this is an important conversation, I'll sometimes do this under the desk. Now, those of you who are going to meet with me, you're going to catch me doing it, right? You're like, I know what he's doing. But this is little things like this that just help you to refocus and to get your brain going. So I wanted to do that because I know I've been talking a lot too. And now we're going to talk about some just hopefully really practical things that we can do. The first one is breathing. Now, sometimes when we talk about breathing, an intentional breath, our mind often goes to maybe like Eastern type of, maybe Buddhist type of things. And some of us, especially if we come from a Christian background, like myself, I'm a pastor, maybe not that comfortable with that because that's a whole different religious thing. And so we might avoid the concept of breathing at all. But I want you to think about it for just a minute. When God, all the way back in Genesis, when God created the heavens and the earth and he speaks everything into existence, and then he kneels down and he's molding out of clay, out of dust, he molds a man, and then what does he do? He breathes the breath of life. The very first gift that God gives every person is a breath, right? It's a sacred gift from God. And then what does the Bible tell us at the end of our lives? In Ecclesiastes, the Bible tells us that the breath returns to God, right? It's this gift that he loans to us. And so we know from Scripture that breath is a gift, that breathing is a gift, but we also know from all kinds of scientific things that if we learn how to breathe in healthy ways, when we're really stressed and we're really overwhelmed, it will calm our system down. And what I've talked about a few times before, basically you cannot heal if you feel unsafe, right? You also cannot move forward if your body is not relaxed. But the opposite is also pretty true. If you can relax your body, sometimes you can relax your mind. So if you're having trouble, like your thoughts are racing, you're overwhelmed, whatever, maybe you can't get in control of your thoughts at that moment, but if you can help your body to relax, you'll often find that slowly your mind will start to relax as well. Again, this doesn't work all the time, but it often does. So here's a few examples that sometimes we do. I want you to Pretend, someone yell out your favorite pizza. What's your favorite type of pizza? Cheese. I heard pineapple. I like that. What'd you say? Buffalo. Okay. What's your favorite pizza place? Papa John's. And someone said no. Where else? Domino's. I heard someone else. Home? Oh, homemade. I heard someone say Chicago. Chicago deep dish pizza is my absolute favorite, man. Giordano's is so good. You guys got to try it if you haven't. It's really bad for you, though. So anyway, I want you to pretend right now that you have a slice of pizza in your hand, okay? And if you don't eat pizza, maybe you're like super vegan, that's awesome. Pretend it's a bowl of soup. Same process, okay? So get your pizza or your soup out, okay? So you've just taken your pizza out of the oven. So, you know, the first time you get that pizza and you're loving it, especially if you love pizza, you want to smell it, right? So I want you to smell it. Take a nice deep breath, right? But the pizza's too hot, okay? So you got to blow on it, you got to cool it down. Now let's do it one more time, smell it. And then cool it down. That's just a real simple way of helping yourself to slowly breathe in a way that will help to calm your body. So this is really good for kids, but it can also be really good for adults as well, right? Again, you see somebody who's just flipped their lid, they're a little overwhelmed. You could be like, hey, let's get our pizzas out. I know it sounds really goofy, but it really does work because it's a reminder. Because what you don't want to tell anybody is, hey, calm down, right? Nobody likes to be told to calm down. It's not that deep. Right, hey, it's not that deep. Why don't you just relax? Just chill. So instead of telling them that, you can say, hey, what if we got our pizzas out? Like, what if we did this thing? Or the other one, like, where are you at right now? So that's one thing that you can do. Another one, we call this the businessman pose. You can do this as well. Just put your hands behind your back, behind your neck, and lean back in your chair. And just breathe. This opens up your whole chest, and you'll feel the stretch. And for most people, unless maybe you have like certain back issues or something, this is going to feel really relaxing. I can't let you do it for much longer because you'll start falling asleep. I see yawning happening already. And now that I said that, everyone else is going to yawn. But that's the same thing. This is a way to relax in your seat or wherever you are that actually allows you to breathe the proper way. Because as crazy as it sounds, most of us don't breathe properly the majority of our day. We don't breathe in an intentional way. Another one that I think is really beautiful, if you really want to have like a time of devotion, a time with God, and you also know that you need to calm down, what you can do is you can remember to breathe in grace and breathe out praise. And what I mean by that is think of some scriptures maybe where God's talking about his grace towards you, maybe a very meaningful scripture to your life. And every time you breathe in, you're breathing in God's grace through that scripture. You're thinking about what he has promised to you. But we also want to respond to God, so we breathe out our praise back to him. So our breathing becomes a prayer to God. And that can be a really beautiful thing, a beautiful time of devotion to God, but it's also something that in a very practical way helps us to relax. So again, we want to understand that breathing is super important, and there's all kinds of other techniques you can do. If you look up on YouTube, you can look up square breathing, and it'll go around. Some of you have seen that before. It'll go around the screen, and it'll tell you when to breathe in and when to breathe out. And the whole point typically is after about 6 or 7 really intentional breaths, like the pizza breathing or the square breathing, after about 6 or 7, your body will oftentimes start entering a more relaxed and restful mode. It doesn't always work. It's not, perfect, but it's something that can really help people when they're having a hard time relaxing. Here's another one. Have you guys heard of, tell me, we got to have some medical people here. Who knows about the vagus nerve? I see a couple hands here, the vagus nerve. Vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the body, if I'm correct, and I'm not coming from a medical background, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it starts somewhere right about here, and it goes all the way down to your pelvis. And what they have found, though, is that stimulating the vagus nerve actually helps your body to relax, which is interesting. So then the question is, well, how do you stimulate the vagus nerve? There's a couple ways that you can do this, and I found this really interesting because one of the first things they said is singing loudly. Now notice I didn't say singing well, which is thankful to me, But singing loudly, if you sing well, that's great. But if you can't sing well, it doesn't matter. Singing loudly. I thought this was really interesting, again, from a church setting, right? Because what do we typically have as part of our church service? Singing, group singing. So just by participating in church, we're actually doing something that helps to relax our body. Like God has set all of these things in place so that if we participate in what He's already set aside for us, we are doing naturally the things that will help us to be resilient people. Now, another one that can work is not just singing loudly, it's also humming. So right now, if you hum, if you have your hands right here, you'll feel a little bit of vibration. That humming actually is stimulating the nerves. And I thought this was interesting too, because I don't know if you know maybe some folks in your life, especially some older folks who have been through a lot in their life. But when they're going about doing their chores or whatever, you'll hear them humming. And I thought that was so interesting because ultimately what those people are doing, without knowing any of the science, most of them, is they're stimulating their vagus nerve and calming themselves. Isn't that powerful? Again, the things that come natural to us oftentimes are these gifts that God has given us that now science is catching up and showing, yeah, these are good things. And we kind of knew they were good things, but we didn't necessarily know why. Another one you can do is you can do a foghorn. You know what the foghorn sounds like? Anybody want to try? What's the foghorn sound like? Oh, you don't want to do that? If you make that, not the loud one, but the ooh, like the ones that are actual foghorns, like for ships and everything. If you make that deep, low sound, sometimes I make a whole crowd do it. I won't make you all do it today, but it's funny to hear. But that also stimulates that vagus nerve. All of these things are things that naturally calm our body down. Here's another one that I think is really cool. And again, coming just from, since I'm a pastor, I come from a biblical perspective for a minute. We know that the Bible tells us to, in all things, give thanks, right? Those of you who have been in church, you probably heard that a few times. Something else that's interesting is in Daniel's story. Now think about Daniel. Was Daniel traumatized perhaps? Perhaps. Yeah, he might have been through some stuff, right? If you know the story of Daniel at all, you know that he was ripped away from his home, from his family. He was forced to go somewhere else to learn new language, new customs. He had to do everything that he was told or he would get in big trouble. And he was trying to maintain his faith in God in this difficult time. Now, the Bible tells us that 3 times a day Daniel went and did what? Prayed. But if I'm correct, if you actually go back and read that verse, it doesn't just say he prayed, it says he gave thanks. And I really think that part of the reason why Daniel's story is so resilient, right? Because Daniel is a long-lasting person in the story. He comes from a young man to an old man in the book of Daniel. And he was a resilient person. He was able to maintain this like living faith in God through some tough circumstances. Part of it is because he gave thanks even in circumstances that were hard to give thanks in. And what they found, again, science is catching up to this, what they found is just thinking of 3 things you're thankful for, specific things you're thankful for each day, rewires your brain pathways. Now, it's hard at first. If you're someone who tends to be a negative person, you know, looking at the negative side of things, partly that's usually because of things that have happened in the past, right? That's why we tend toward negativity, because in the past things haven't worked out like we wanted them to work. But if you are that person who kind of tends towards thinking, oh yeah, it's not going to work out, or oh, yeah, but that wasn't that great, or whatever, it's going to be hard for you to be consistently thankful because your brain pathway will automatically go that direction. However, if you do this every day, again, just take a journal, whatever, maybe you don't like the word journal, a notebook, and just write down 3 things each day that you're, like specifically, I'm just going to think of these 3 things. And you change nothing else about your life. They say that over time, your pathways are going to start changing where you are a more hopeful person. And it can actually help you to come out of some dark spaces in your life. So I encourage you to do that. I thought about this. If I did 3 things a day, over the course of a year, I have over 1,000 things that I'm grateful for. So even in the midst of the most challenging circumstances, if we can find just 3 things, you have 1,000 things in a year that you can truly be thankful for. And what that means is, if you did this ongoing for 10 years, you'd have 10,000 reasons that you are thankful for your life and for the things in your life. And that can truly transform. And again, science is demonstrating this. You'll create new pathways in your brain. So Very practical things. I know it sounds crazy when the Bible says, hey, be thankful, but there's something actually behind that. If we spend our time being intentionally thankful, if we spend our time being, singing, and if we spend our time breathing properly, it changes the way we approach life. Here's one other one. We talked about felt safety. I see I'm going over time, so this will be my last one for now. Felt safety, again, is about not just whether or not there's fire exits. Those things are important, but it's about how we internally feel. And what we have found over and over again is some of the best ways for us to feel like we're in a safe place and that we're healthy is for us to take care of ourselves, take care of our bodies. You may not be surprised by this, but maybe you are. Oftentimes when people come to a counselor and they're talking about all of these things that they're struggling with and they don't really know what to do, sometimes the first questions are, how much water have you been drinking lately? How often do you eat? Tell me a little bit about your eating habits. And people are like, well, I'm coming to you because I'm depressed. So why are you asking me about my diet? Like, that's rude. But what we found over and over again is that we're whole creatures, right? And so our brain is an organ. It's impacted by what we do with our body. And I don't have the statistic with me now, but I was just reading up on even dehydration, how dehydration can be linked to depression. So if you're not drinking enough water every day, that might be part of the reason why you're feeling down or having a hard time getting through some of the other stuff that you're going through. Again, I don't want you to come away from this saying, oh yeah, I'm super sad, so drinking water is going to fix everything. That's not the reality. Drinking water is not going to just solve all the traumatic situations in your life. However, we do know for sure that it has an impact on how resilient you are in the midst of everything that's going on. Eating snacks, or at least having a healthy diet. For kids oftentimes need snacks. But movement, exercise, getting outside, doing something every day, even if it's just 10 or 15 minutes. If I'm redder today, it's because I was invited to go play basketball and I forgot sunscreen. And so I got movement and sunshine, but maybe a little too much of both of those. I was humbled a little bit. But we need that. We need sunshine. I know, again, it sounds crazy, but sometimes with our lifestyle, with how busy we get, I found myself where it's the end of the day and I'm like, I haven't actually spent any time outside this entire day. Well, no wonder I'm struggling a little bit. We're made to be outdoor creatures sometimes. We need time in nature. We also need calming environments at certain points. So if your house is filled with chaos, if your work is filled with chaos, if your anything else, your school is filled with chaos, you've got to have some place that can kind of be your space that you can go to on a regular basis that will help you to sort of feel calm. And there's a whole other presentation I have done in the past on trauma-informed like churches and schools, and it's how we set up our environment changes so much about how relaxed people feel. Our lighting, the way people enter, all of these things really has an impact on our well-being. We're very, very connected to our environments, much more than we usually realize. Okay, I think that we're going to pick it up here tomorrow. Before we go, I'll take just 3 or 4 minutes. Does anyone have any thoughts or any questions based on the things that we've talked about today? Just any sort of feedback is perfectly fine.
I would just like to thank you for the information about maybe resting 30 minutes or so before bedtime. I did that last night and turned off the TV, turned off the radio, turned off the game and the phone, and I slept much better, so thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. That is really good. That's something that I am very guilty of not doing, and I need to do better. So I've got to practice what I preach for sure.
Is self-talking a strategy, or is it a good thing?
Self-talking? Is that what you're saying? Yes. When you say self-talking, what do you mean by that?
In your head, we're to the point where, you don't even have to.
So, okay. I think it would very much depend on what you're saying in your head.
No, I mean in terms of using to talk yourself down.
I see.
or
I see.
Talk yourself through something.
Yes.
Is that a good thing? Because you can get a response.
Right. So, So different people respond differently. Well, that's one thing. So some people do really well with just sort of thinking things through in their head. Other people, that's not going to work for them. Some people need to verbalize. They got to talk to somebody before it makes sense. They're external, processors. But there's also like a big part of, if you've ever heard of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, that's a lot of counseling that takes place. A lot of that is we're identifying the thoughts that we're telling ourselves in our head, and we're identifying the ones that are positive versus the ones that might be causing part of the problem. And so self-talk is important, but the reality is most of us have an internal critic that is very loud. And oftentimes we listen to that critic more than we listen to the people around us, right? So I could tell you, you are an incredibly talented, you're an incredibly intelligent person, but if you tell yourself that you're not smart, you tend to believe yourself over me. And so a lot of what we have to do is confront the negative self-talk and let God and let other people speak truth into our lives. Okay, yes?
Being resilient, or whatever that word is, will that help you deal with your trauma in a different way than most people would deal with it if they weren't resilient?
Yes, so being resilient is dealing with the adversity and the trauma that happens to you, right? That's ultimately what it is. So if you become a truly resilient person, part of that process is that you're dealing with the trauma, the things that have happened to you. You're able to process it in such a way that you acknowledge it took place, but it's not going to define the rest of your life, right? And so these tools and these tricks, this isn't everything. If someone's had a lot of trauma in their life, they often have to process it in a very intentional way. However, these things will help you to be able to be in a place where you feel healthy enough to actually deal with it. One thing before you get to your question, I do want to point this out because you brought up a really important point. A lot of times people think, so there's a lot of different types of counseling, right? Some counselors will have you talk about your trauma as soon as you get in the building, right? Tell me everything that happened to you. But what we found over and over again is that stirs so much up. We've talked about overwhelming your system, flipping your lid, right? And so people who just get in there and they just start talking about all this trauma before they're ready for it, it actually can be damaging to them because they're not ready to handle everything that comes up. And so they'll leave the counseling session feeling terrible and then going to their coping strategies, right? So if they used to be an addict, I've seen many people who they talk about their trauma, they might have been sober for a while, but now they want to go back and drink or use other substances. Well, that's because we haven't built in all these tools. So what I'm trying to tell you about right now are some of the tools to help you to manage the stress as it comes. And then you get to a place where you're like, okay, I think I can talk about my trauma and know when it's getting too much for me and be able to put it back away, right, and bring myself back down again. So there's all kinds of different counselors, but if you do have a trauma history, I would encourage you, if you're thinking about counseling, to find someone who has training in trauma because it's a totally different process. Like for me, in my training, I'm not going to ask people about what happened to them for a long time, right? We're going to start with today. How are you managing today? Then we're going to talk about the tools, how we're going to get better in managing our stress today. And then when you feel like you feel comfortable enough to manage this stress, now we can start exploring some of the stuff that's happened in the past. So that's just, if you're not ready to talk about it, that's okay. There's probably going to come a time where you would need to talk about it, but it's not right away, not early on for most people.
Okay, so my question is about where does the power of choice come in? Again, someone flips my switch, I'm up here, and I choose not to respond right away. But I'm boiling on the inside, and so I walk away. Mm-hmm. You know, it doesn't escalate. I walk away, and maybe forget. I don't know if this is a coping mechanism, but I walk away. But every time I see that person, you know, they rub me the wrong way, but I still don't respond to them. I don't show any kind of reaction. Where does my choosing not to respond, is that a coping strategy? And I mean, is it building, am I allowing this thing to build up to lead to unforgiveness? That's where I'm going with that question.
So really a lot of what you're talking about there is about conflict, right? And so what you're doing at the beginning, not you specifically, but in this example, is you're saying, I'm up here, this is not a healthy time to have a conflict, right? I'm not going to be in a good place for that conflict. So we walk away. That's a good thing for the most part, right? That's a healthy thing, especially if we communicate. I can't talk about this right now. However, if we walk away from that conflict and we get back down here and we never intentionally come back to what the conflict was about, then we have resentment and bitterness most of the time. And what that usually is we're a conflict avoidant. We don't like conflict, so we'd rather just sort of pretend that it didn't take place. Problem is we internalize it, right? It just stays inside and becomes a bit of a poison to us. So conflict is not a bad thing. We need conflict sometimes. We just have to have it in healthy ways, which means that if we're up here, this is not the time for the conflict. We're going to bring it back down here. Then we're going to talk about, here's the issue that I'm having. Here's the real problem that's going on, right? I feel like you're not listening to me. I feel like I'm not heard, whatever it is, right? And we can talk about it. But when we try to talk about it here, it's going to go in one ear, out the other.
Question. Thank you for that. Can avoidance impact how resilient you are in coping with trauma?
I think so. If I'm understanding you correctly, I think absolutely. So when we talk about a stress response, one of them is fight. So fight is when you want to get in that argument. But another one is flight. And that's what avoidance is, right? So we're trying to avoid whatever that situation is. A lot of the things that we do that are really not good for us is usually us avoiding negative emotions, right? That's at the end of the day, we're trying to avoid maybe some pain, some sadness, some feeling of failure. But that's not a solution long term. We can avoid it a little bit, but if you avoid it, it builds up and builds up and builds up and then spills out somewhere else. And so at some point we have to deal with whatever that negative emotion is and what's causing it. Yeah, I see a couple more. And I know that if you have to go, I understand, thank you, but I'll keep going with the Q&A for now and probably stop in just a couple minutes.
What is the best way to determine whether a coping skill is healthy or harmful?
That's a great question. How can you tell when a coping skill is healthy or not healthy or helpful or not helpful? I would say my first question is like, what's the result of the coping skill? In other words, when you do this thing, what tends to happen? How do you feel about it? How does it impact your family? How does it impact your work or whatever? If you're trying something to cope, but it leaves you feeling more frustrated or more empty, right? That's why a lot of people, I'm going to use alcohol as an example. This is why a lot of people drink. People drink because it's their way of coping, right? It helps them to feel better in that moment. But what's the end result? We know that alcohol is a depressant. So when you drink, you get that initial feeling good, but later on, you actually feel much worse. And you often have made decisions that you regret later on. So the coping mechanism, you might feel good in that moment, but later on, it's actually putting you in a worse place, and we're still avoiding the process. Other things, some coping skills can be really good sometimes, but if we overdo them or if we're still avoiding or whatever else, it could end up not being healthy for us. So that's a long answer to say, what's the result of whatever you're using to cope?
She got one more and then here.
Okay.
We were talking about bottling up emotions. Like, what is a good strategy to help someone that has that coping mechanism? They just continue to bottle up their emotions and never express themselves, and you're trying to be there for them or kind of help talk through some things, but they're not really offering much out.
That's a good question, and I think that's a very common one, right? Because we have very emotionally expressive people, and then we have people who just are not comfortable with emotion. I would say, some of it is specific to every situation, right? Part of it is I would want to know if that person even wants to change, right? Because if a person doesn't want to change, you can want to be a support for them all you want, and you can want what's best for them, but oftentimes it's just going to be painful for you because they're not in a place where they're actually wanting to put in that work themselves. So if somebody's in a place where they're just really uncomfortable with emotion and you're encouraging them, but they just don't want to go there, the challenging thing is maybe they're just not at a place where they're actually ready to be healthy. And then the question is, well, what are we going to do about it, right? Depending on our relationship, we may have to make decisions based on their willingness or unwillingness to be a healthy person.
How do you go about stopping a coping mechanism that works for you, but it's damaging your relationship with people that care about you?
That's a good question. If you want to end, so going back to the alcohol as an example, again, I'm not assuming this is just a helpful example for me. A lot of times what we try to do when somebody who is an alcoholic is we try to just remove the alcohol from the equation, right? Or if someone's an addict, we try to remove the drug, whatever it is. The problem is if it's not replaced by something else, and if we don't deal with what's going on underneath that, then we're just going to either replace one addiction for another, or we're going to make it so that they go back to that one again. So if someone has a coping mechanism that says, okay, I know long-term this isn't healthy for me, or it might be working for me, but it's not good for the family dynamic or whatever, we need to say, okay, well, what would work? Like, let's try something else. Let's replace this thing with something that might actually be healthier long-term or better. It's hard to know, since we're talking in very broad ways, it's hard to know what you mean by how it's impacting the family. But I would say in general, if there's something that we know we're using to cope, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit tomorrow too, that we know isn't the best for us, yes, we need to remove that, like that's the end goal, but we also need to replace it. We need to kind of deal with whatever's underneath all of that. Why do we feel like we need to have this in order to cope to begin with? Does that make sense at all? I don't know if that answered your question very well. If not, we can talk more later. Anybody else had something? Oh, yes.
So my question kind of bounces off of her question with regards to, like, let's say you have a conflict with somebody, you flip your lid, you step away, you calm down, you're centered again, you go talk to the other person because they seem to be okay, but as soon as you bring up the issue, they flip their lid, and every time you try to talk to them, their lid flips.
Yeah.
How are you able to have healthy conversations with that person to resolve that issue?
Yeah.
If they can't, deal with that situation?
Yeah. When someone is very emotionally reactive, it is hard for a person to be healthy with that person, right? Because it takes two people in order to have a healthy conversation, a healthy relationship. Depending on the dynamic, it's a little bit different, right? Like, so if it's a child talking about their parent versus a boyfriend and girlfriend, or a friend and a friend, we would do things a little bit differently, right? Just because the dynamics are different. But at the end of the day, I think that it's always good to ask, is this a good time? And if they keep saying, no, it's not a good time, right? When is a good time? Because I really think we need to talk about this. And if every time it gets brought up, that we just can't seem to talk about this, it may not be on you anymore. It may be about the other person, right? And if they don't want to be healthy, then again, we have to figure out what we're going to do in response. How are we going to protect our own mental health when this other person perhaps is not ready to be healthy? Because the reality is not everyone is ready or wanting to be a healthy person at this point. So we have to respond in our own way. I wish it was as simple as, well, just do this, this, and this, and then you'll have a great conversation. But some people live their whole lives, and there's certain subjects that they're always going to flip their lid on because they're not ready. They're protecting themselves. And again, a lot of times it's because of something that's happened in their past. So they're going back to fight, flight immediately because they feel like they have to protect themselves. It's a very painful thing. But I do think setting aside intentional times and being sure, like, this is the subject. Will you please allow me to talk about this subject with you? Can we sit down and do this? Sometimes we can have a better outcome because of that, but not always. Do we have anybody else? Okay.
I think it's more of a statement thanking you for the presentation, and I hear a number of questions, and sometimes we might have friends that would like to, they're going through a trauma situation, and we want to help them, but we have to ask them permission to help them and say, how can I be there for you? Because sometimes all they need is just a hug.
That's right.
While other time they say, I just want to talk. So one of the things is that we have to ask the person, even if the person is our friend, how can I be there for you? How can I help you in this situation? And whatever barrier there might be, you would break through that barrier because they would have given you that permission to get through that barrier.
I really appreciate that. Asking permission when it comes to helping other people and asking what they actually need instead of assuming is such a huge part of the thing. You know, when I'm going through something, sometimes I want to talk about it. But there's other times where I'd want to do anything but talk about this right now. But I just want to hang out with a friend. Like I kind of just want to have fun just for once because I'm going through so much. And so we as helpers, if we're the one trying to support somebody, it's really important for us to ask, you know, and it's perfectly fine. Would you like to talk about it? Would you like to talk about something else? Do you want space? Do you want me to be here? What would feel the best for you? And most people will really appreciate that you ask those types of questions. It can be really very meaningful for them. Thank you for your time. We'll have more time for conversation, for Q&A tomorrow as well. I've changed the schedule a little bit, so we're going to continue with tools and things tomorrow about what we can do, and we'll keep having this conversation. And then the next day, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about how do we help somebody who's going through some really heavy stuff? What are some things we do and do not do that can be particularly helpful? If it's okay, I'm going to pray right now, and then I think we're going to end for the night. Dear Father, thank you so much that you have created us in a fearful and wonderful way, that you offer so many opportunities, knowing that we are going to go through adversity and trauma and pain and struggle, knowing that you're not always going to protect us from everything that can happen in this world. You have created us to be resilient people. I pray that you be with each person here, everybody who's online. You know what they're carrying, you know what their struggles are. I pray that you help us to be people who truly want to be resilient, that want to be healthy, that want to cope with things in healthy ways. And Lord, if we have friends and family who are really struggling, help us to know how best to help them, because sometimes we don't know what to do. We love you and we thank you for this time. In Jesus' name, amen.
So just real quick, before you guys leave, if you're interested in just having a conversation with our presenter, James Mello, for the next couple of days while he's here at some point, I'm going to ask you to come over here. This is Pastor Jose, and I'm going to ask you to just give him your contact info, so then we could just make that connection, because I just realized that I don't want to hold him up or have like a few people just sitting here. So if you want to have a personal conversation, just get your contact information to Pastor Jose, and we'll get that scheduled. Also, our prayer ministries director, Juliet, Caitlin, is here. And if you would like prayer over a specific situation, please feel free to go over there and let her know. She'd be happy to pray with you. We also have a prayer team that can pray. We could keep it as anonymous as possible. Last thing, tomorrow, or last two things. Tomorrow, we're going to have a gentleman named Willis Rains who will join us. He'll be in the building. So he has an organization that goes nationally and internationally to schools dealing with anti-bullying, doing just training seminars and things, combating bullying, as well as suicide prevention. So he is a very good resource if you want to ask him questions. He's not going to do the presentation. We're going to have James Mello still doing the presentation, but he's going to be in the house. So if afterwards you want to ask him specific, you want to maybe meet with him for just a moment, ask for some specific questions in regards to that, or if you know somebody who's dealing with bullying or dealing with those thoughts, and especially young people, they can come, or a parent can come, or somebody. And he works in the Macon Warner Robins area. He travels internationally, but this is home, so he's a very good resource that can point you to somebody directly in this area as well, and his wife is also a counselor. And then on Wednesday, we have our chaplain, Seymour Palmer here. Chaplain Palmer, if you don't mind coming up for just a second, just so people can kind of catch a glance at you. So Chaplain Seymour Palmer, he works with people in a wide variety of areas, but if you if you have a specific question in regards to relating, connecting with somebody who is grieving or dealing with heavy grieving, or if you yourself are a loss, not that that's the only area that he can do, but that's an area where I've heard him speak. I know he knows what he is talking about. He also is a resource if you want to talk to him, be it this evening or on Wednesday. He's going to make the effort to be over here Wednesday evening. So if you know somebody, because sometimes you're like, man, there's somebody in my family or a friend who's going through something heavy, but I don't want to approach, I don't want to say the wrong thing, or I want to be helpful, not harmful. He's very trained in this area, so he would be a good source to ask questions. So he's here tonight, and he'll be here on Wednesday evening. So I just want to leave you with that, let you know that there will be individuals who you can have private conversations with. Before you get out of here, we will have Wednesday as well. We're going to have a lot of resources out on a table of some local counseling centers and therapy places, so that you can walk out of here with something in your hand. On your way out, feel free to get some food. I know you're wondering what that mystery meat was that you were eating earlier. We don't want to have anything left over, so please, if you know somebody in your home, or if yourself, you just don't want to cook for the rest of the week, please pack some up, take it with you, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow at 6:30. God bless.